Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tim Green. I'm a co-director of the Energy Futures Lab. First of all, apology for our slightly late start. Even after all these months of online meetings, we hit a few technical glitches, but we're back in control of the situation and ready to go. So I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's event, which is the invited IDLES lecture delivered by one of our industrial partners, who we'll introduce in a few minutes. Just a very short introduction to the Energy Futures Lab. We are one of the 7 global institutes at Imperial College London. We were established back in 2005 to address some of the world's major challenges in the energy sector by bringing together researchers from varied backgrounds across the university to carry out high impact and multidisciplinary research. As part of that, we established something called the IDLES program. It's a 5-year program funded by EPSRC and hosted by Energy Futures Lab. And it centers on the analysis of whole energy systems in order to provide evidence on the cost-effective routes to zero carbon and secure transition of energy systems for the future. I will now hand over to our chair for this afternoon's event, which is Professor Richard Green. Richard is one of the co-investigators on the IDLES program, in particular looking at energy markets for future zero carbon energy systems, and he's a professor of sustainable energy business at the Business School at Imperial College. Richard.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's a real pleasure to introduce Michael, who I've known for a number of years and has always been very generous in sharing his knowledge of renewable energy and its financing. He's acquired that knowledge over many years in the sector. For the last 15 years, he was a partner at BDO in London, responsible for their energy finance team, working with clients to structure energy transactions, building financial models, write the business cases, present projects to funders, negotiate the contracts, manage due diligence, and raise the relevant money. In a sense, everything that has to be done by the people apart from the engineers. He's worked on over 100 deals and raised over £3 billion, and also managed the sale of several operational solar and wind projects to the infrastructure and pension funds that have potentially got very large amounts of money that could be put into the energy transition if we arrange it right. That's what he was doing in the past. Since 2019, he's been a director at Green Giraffe, which is a specialised renewable energy financial advisory firm, and originating and leading a number of deals there, particularly in waste to energy, anaerobic digestion, solar and storage, but it's in particular biogas, so effectively mostly anaerobic digestion, that he has been talking about here. And so he's a Chartered Institute of Public Finance accountant with an MBA from Manchester Business School, and I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say, Michael. Since Catherine's going to be moving your slides, I suggest you say slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, rather, just in case we get out of sync. So that's probably the best way to do it. Anyway, over to you, and I look forward to what you have to say.
Yeah, apologies, you can't actually see me, but you're not missing much. I reassure you. Imagine Alex Salmond. I look an awful lot like Alex Salmond, so have that image in your head. Slide number 2, Catherine. So what I'm going to talk about for about half an hour, and I'll take questions and comments at the end, is really a little bit about who we are, Greendraft, a little bit about what is project finance for those of you who are not familiar, and apologies if you're very familiar with the concept. Talk quite a lot about anaerobic digestion and how it works. Talk about the road fuel transport obligation scheme, and then I'll talk about financing biogas plants and how they differ from financing wind or solar, and then we'll take conclusion and questions. So Catherine, number 3. So Greendraft, we are strangely named. We're never quite sure why we're called Greendraft. I think it's something about aspirational and reaching for things. We are probably the largest dedicated renewable energy advisory firm in the world. We employ about 120 people. We've been going for about 10 years, and we've raised over £30 billion to build renewable energy projects worldwide. Slide 4. you'll see that we're active in the US, Africa, Europe, and we've just opened an office in Singapore and the Far East, and we're looking at offices in Eastern Europe and possibly something in Russia. Slide 5. Renewable energy has been on a bit of a journey. When we very first started, we were doing offshore wind, solar and ground-mounted solar, onshore wind and offshore wind. We've now moved into waste to energy, storage, hydrogen, sustainable heating and recycling. And our journey with wind has followed the technology. So we started with fixed bottom wind turbines offshore, where the turbine is physically attached to the seabed. And we're now leading the way in floating offshore wind, where, as the name suggests, the turbine isn't attached to the seabed anymore, it's floating. The huge advantage of floating offshore wind is that you can bring in an awful lot more sites that become accessible to the land. You take the coast of Japan, for example, the sea is very deep very quickly. So fixed wind doesn't work in Japan, but floating does. And that's the sort of thing that, as an advisory firm, we're trying to keep a pace of technologies and go where the market is going. And the next big thing, as we see it, will become biogas, as I'll explain. It's 6, Catherine. So I'll now talk briefly about project finance and slide 7. Project finance is an interesting concept in financing structures. In essence, the funders, the banks and the equity investors, they fund the project and not the company, hence the name project finance. And there's a concept of no recourse financing. So if the project goes under or goes wrong, the lenders and the investors lose all their money and they have no recourse back to the shareholders in the project. So unlike corporate financing, where they're lending to a company, in project financing, they are lending purely to a project. And virtually all renewable energy financing works on the basis of project finance. And a regularly repeated phrase is, this is not project finance, or this is not how project finance works. So there's a way of doing things under the umbrella of project finance that all of the funders and bankers understand and they expect to see on every deal. And that's what I'm going to talk to you partially about today. All project finance deals look the same in the sense that you build an asset, like a wind farm, or in our case, a biogas plant, etc. And the asset generates a long-term and predictable cash flow. So the investors lend money to build the asset initially, and then they recover their investment from the cash flows generated by that asset. So the issue then is there are a number of risks, which we're going to talk about today, but principally, can I build my asset on time and to budget? Secondly, will the asset generate the cash flows that I thought it would generate? And are those cash flows sufficient to repay my debt and to make a return on my equity? So they're the sort of questions that every funder will ask about every project in this space. How much will it cost to build? How certain can I be that you can build it on time and to budget and that it will work? And then how certain can I be about the cash flows that are attached to that asset? And this is where biogas is more difficult to do than, say, wind or solar. So you imagine a solar panel, it's a very simple thing to project finance. The cost of panels is very secure, the technology is proven and it works. I get a field, I put 5 megawatts of panels in, I can guarantee the sun will come up for the next 20 years, and I can work out the return on my investment. Biogas, as we're going to see, is much more complicated in terms of the risk and hence much harder to fund. And that's the point of today's lecture. Slide number 8, Catherine. And Catherine, can you just confirm this is working? I haven't heard any feedback to the counter.
Yes, hello? It is the slide that you are exactly in sync, Michael.
Great, excellent. So just a little bit more on project finance. So here what we see on the project finance is that we're not lending to a company, we're lending to a project. And so we set up a new company, typically called a special purpose vehicle or SPV, and the loan is to the new company, and the investors take shares in the new company, and the bank lends money to the new company. And this structure is also is commonly used both by individuals and by companies. So you'll get a situation where a company sets up another company, if you see what I'm saying, takes shares in that new company, and then the bank lend money to the new company. And if the new company goes under, the bank cannot have any recourse back to the original company, if that makes sense. So we see SPVs, this is a world unfortunately full of acronyms and initializations. We see special purpose vehicles, SPVs, set up behind pretty much every renewable energy project in the world will have an SPV which will be owned by shareholders. Slide number 9. So I can come back to project finance. There's probably a whole hour's lecture on just how project finance works, but that's in essence project finance, which is it's a new company set up to build the project. The funders, both the bank and the investors, have no recourse beyond that new company. And typically, the company will build an asset for a fixed price and a fixed period of construction, and then that asset will generate a cash flow for the next 20 years, and that cash flow is used to recover the bank's initial investment. Okay, so how does that work in biogas? So the first thing is anaerobic digestion. And the little diagram here, are we on slide 10, Catherine?
Yes.
A little man standing on top of an AD plant. Is that what you can see?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. So anaerobic digestion, anaerobic means without oxygen. And in essence, what we're doing is we're taking long chain hydrocarbon molecules, we're putting them inside a tank, and we'll talk about what those molecules are in a minute. And because there's no O molecules inside the tank, they will decompose with bacteria, and they have to form CO2 and CH4 because they don't have enough O molecules to form H2O and CO2. So very basic chemistry. Long chain hydrocarbon molecule that has lots of C molecules, H molecules, O's and N's. If we put it in a tank without air, and the bacteria will break it down, and because there's no O molecules inside the tank, it has to make methane, which is CH4, and it has to make CO2. And hence biogas, or raw biogas as it's known, is a mixture primarily of CO2 and CH4. And the valuable bit to us is the CH4, which we can then either burn, so in turn it will then make CO2 and H2O, but will release energy in the process, or we can compress it and squirt it into the gas grid, or we can turn it into a liquid and put it into the engines of trucks. And any organic matter can be turned into CO2 or CH4. So if we go to slide 11, what you'll see here is there's a range of feedstocks we can use, from manure through to sewage waste. It's not a nice space, this, food waste, or we can grow crops specifically to create a gas from AD plants. And I'm the non-executive director of the world's biggest crop-fed AD plant in Cambridge, and we grow about 500,000 tons a year of maize specifically to feed our AD plants. The issue with the feedstock is the amount of energy that is in the feedstock depends on what it is. And this is just basic biology and chemistry. If I put maize into my plant, there's a lot of energy in maize. If I go to the other end of the spectrum and put manure in my plant, there's far less energy left in the manure because the cow or the pig have taken it out for mooing and walking about and what have you. So basic biology, really. So if we put in high energy crops at the start, we get much more gas than if we put low energy crops in. And as we'll see from the next slide, gas yield is the key metric in this space. The other issue to bear in mind here is that this is a biological, unlike solar or wind, this is a biological process. We are relying, sorry, Catherine, can you just go back to 10? Once we put the feedstock into the tank, we are relying on the bacteria to convert that feedstock into CH4 and CO2. So in essence, we have millions and millions of bacteria doing the work for us. And Catherine, go back to 11. So obviously, feeding that bacteria becomes then a chemical question, and most plants employ chemists either full or part-time just to manage the chemical balance within the tank. And it's fine if you're putting in crops or manure because they are very homogeneous feedstock, has the same chemical composition every day. If you're putting in food waste, the chemical composition of the feedstock bounces around all over the place and hence bounces around your gas yield. So for example, cake, pork pies, fatty things that make you fat also produce a lot of gas because they've got a lot of energy. Whereas if we fill our tank full of lettuce, the gas yield would fall off a cliff. So food waste plants are much harder to manage than crop-based or manure-based plants because the chemical composition of the feedstock is unpredictable. Does that make sense? So then we look at the outputs of the plant, and it has three basic outputs. It produces biogas, that's our CH4 and our CO2. We can split out the CH4 from the CO2, and we can either burn the CH4 or we can compress it or we can put it into the gas grid, and we can capture the CO2 and sell it to the food industry. And as you've seen this week, this food industry is very reliant upon supplies of CO2. However, the gas loss is not complete. So as well as producing gas, we're left with what we call digestate, which is the mass of the crop that we put in less the gas that's been released. And we can either turn the digestate into products like building materials, or we can use them as fertilizer because it's full of nitrogen. So just in summary terms, we put organic material into the plant, we shut the doors, it's exposed to bacteria, the bacteria decompose the long-chain hydrocarbon molecules to make biogas and digestate. Biogas is a mixture of CO2 and CH4, which we can split using membranes. We can then do valuable things with the CH4 because it's full of energy, and we can sell the CO2 to the food industry. And then the digestate we can either use as fertilizer, or we can turn into pellets for burning, or we can turn into bricks or something. Okay, slide 12. So the key maths of all of this, the key metric in all of this is gas yield per ton of feedstock. And as I said before, this will vary according to the chemical composition of the feedstock. So the more energy there is in the feedstock, the more gas we get per ton. But just as an example, a ton of straw will yield about 425 cubic meters of gas per ton over a period of about 30 days. It doesn't take place instantly. It takes, the bacteria will munch away for about 20, 30 days, and over that time they'll release 425 meters of gas. We then split the gas into CO2 and CH4, either through physical membranes, so molecules can pass through the filter and other molecules can't, or we can liquefy, and CH4 liquefies at a different temperature to CO2. So it's like an oil refinery in reverse. We then convert the gas into tons, and we times the number of tons by the number of hours a year we run the plant. So if we put 1 ton an hour of gas into of straw into a plant for a whole year, we would get 1,500 tons of CH4 out the other side. And obviously, if we put more tons per hour in, we get more gas per year and more tons of CH4 per year. And 1 ton an hour is a very small plant. Typically, they're 10 to 15 tons an hour on average. Okay, slide 13, Catherine. So can you see a big picture of an AD plant here, Richard?
I can indeed, yes.
So just talk you through what we're seeing on the slide. So to the right-hand side, where there's that big green tarpaulin, this is a crop-based plant, and underneath that green tarpaulin is maize, which you can see the little brown thing to the top. So we harvest the maize, let's say September, October, and we store it for a whole year under the green tarpaulin to stop it rotting, and then we feed it into the plant. The 2 tanks are where we're feeding in the gas, the maize. So we put the maize into the plant with the big grey roof, and it will stay there for 30 days. And then we'll move it to the second tank, and it will stay there for another 20 days. And the gas yield will be over those 50-day period. And then the little white building with the exhaust to the left-hand side of the big grey tank, that's our gas CHP engine. So that is taking the gas and burning it to make electricity. And the little sticking up stack thing is the exhaust, and the little things on the top of the plant are the cooling system for the CHP plant. So from the right-hand side, we've got feedstock, which we've harvested over the course of a year. During harvest time, we've stored it for a year. These things are known as clamps. We put the feedstock into the tanks. The bacteria eat it, turn it into gas. We capture the gas, and we feed it into the engine, and the engine burns the gas to make electricity. And at the bottom left-hand side, you'll see another little thing. That's a flare. In case we can't use the gas in our engine, in case our engine is down for maintenance, we will flare the gas, because every day the bacteria produce more gas and we don't have any easy ways of storing it. Obviously, flaring gas is very painful because it has a value, and so you don't really want to see the flare working very often. Then if we come down to 14, this is the Siemens landfill gas plant in Istanbul, which is the world's largest, makes 90 megawatts of power per hour. Landfill gas is exactly the same concept. And what we've done is we put the rubbish in the ground and we've covered it with soil, and then the rubbish will decompose under the ground in exactly the same way as it would do in an AD tank, and produces landfill gas, which is the same thing, CH4 plus CO2. We capture the gas in that little dome and we burn it in the power plants. So landfill is just an uncontrolled version of anaerobic digestion, but it has exactly the same outputs of producing methane and CO2. And the reason governments across the world are less keen on landfill is because it's hard to control the emissions. And methane, although it's a very valuable gas that we can burn to make electricity or put into trucks, it's also a very powerful greenhouse gas. And so uncontrolled methane from landfill is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is why the government wants to ban landfill, because they create methane which we can't easily capture. It can be captured, but it's not easy to do. And obviously it can leak out. So they'd rather AD plants is a much more controlled version of landfill gas. Okay, 16. I'm going to go off at a slight tangent here. What we also have is the renewable fuel transport obligation. And I'm just going to dwell on this briefly because this is a very interesting area of huge amount of growth by the oil companies. The governments across Europe have said to the oil companies that they have to blend their fuel production. 16, yeah. 16, Richard, sorry, I jumped a slide. They have to blend their fossil fuel production, i.e. oil that comes out of the ground, with fuel made from renewable sources. And you remember at the start we said we can compress methane or CH4 and it can become liquid natural gas. It's the same as the gas that comes out of the ground, it's just a compressed version. So if I'm a fuel producer like BP, I have to source 10% of my total fuel supply from renewable sources. Then the interesting thing here is if I can't physically buy the fuel because there's none available, I can buy a certificate from someone who makes the fuel. This is a very strange concept, but bear with me, it will make sense. And I can say to the government, well, I didn't physically blend in 10% of the fuel, but I did buy 10% worth of certificates. This means that if I'm a biogas producer, I can sell my product twice. I can physically sell the gas to Shell, and they can blend their fuel and say they met their 10% obligation. And I can sell the equivalent of 10% certificates to BP. So both BP and Shell would then say they put in 10% of the fuel. Obviously, only Shell actually did, and BP paid me the certificates. And I, as a biogas producer, get paid twice for the same unit of gas. Slightly unusual concept, and forgive me if you've not come across this before. What it means, the reason the government have done this is it doubles the incentive for biogas producers to make gas, because suddenly my plant becomes very lucrative. I can sell the gas to Shell, I can sell the certificates to BP, and hence I'm incentivized to build biogas plants, because the gas is twice as valuable as it would be normally if I just sold it to Shell. And on the back of this, hundreds of millions, if not billions, is being invested in Europe in building biogas plants to supply fuel for transport. And people like Shell and BP are buying this fuel. Now, you might well ask, what about electrification? Why are they still relying on fuel-based transport when they could electrify their trucks? And this is just basic physics. It's very hard, if not impossible, to create enough energy to power a heavy-duty transport like a truck or a train from a battery. The battery becomes enormous. And hence, the government sees that in the short term, at least for the next 20, 30 years, battery technology is not going to be there. And we will need to continue to power trucks and trains by fossil fuel-based fuels or liquid fuels rather than batteries. But obviously, rather than rely on fossil fuels which create emissions, we want to incentivize renewable fuels such as biogas, and hence we have this RT-EVO scheme. So just, I appreciate this is a very esoteric concept, but just in headline terms, fuel suppliers like BP and Shell have to source 10% of their fuel from renewables. If they can't physically buy the product, they can buy a paper certificate, which is equivalent to the 10%. And then the people who make renewable fuels can sell their product twice. They can sell the gas to one company and they can sell the certificates to somebody else. The reason the governments have done this is to encourage investment in renewable fuels. And it's working in that there's hundreds of millions being spent in Europe next year, in the next 5 years, to build biogas plants to power the transport sector. Okay, right, one more slide and then I'll take questions. So 18. So then we look at the bank's perspective on all of this and how do they finance these plants and what are the risks. You remember right at the start, I said that there's no recourse beyond the SPV, the new company we've set up to build the plant. So the banks will impose several constraints upon the SPV to make sure that it makes money. Firstly, there's a thing called a debt service cover ratio, a DSCR. And this is the relationship between the cash flow generated by the asset and the amount of money it needs to pay the principal and interest on the debt. Conceptually, it's a bit like the relationship between your salary and your rent. And the bank will say your cash flow has to be at least 130% of the interest and principal payments on the debt. And hence the bank are giving themselves a little buffer of 30%, that if anything goes wrong, it's got to go fairly spectacularly wrong before you go below 1, and hence they'll always get paid. And if you work in the renewable industry, in finance, you spend your whole day talking about debt service cover ratios. This is the key metric that everyone's obsessed with. Secondly, gearing. The banks won't lend you 100%. They'll probably lend you 70 to 80%, and the rest is funded by equity. So again, there's a second buffer for them there, that they haven't lent 100% of the project, they've lent maybe 80%. Thirdly, interest rates, expressed as a margin above base rates. Everyone talks about margins and not interest rates. And these are typically 2 to 4%, but obviously base rates at the moment are very low, hence the cost of finance is very low. And finally, they'll require reserve accounts. These are on the balance sheet. These are physical cash accounts that you have to put money into. And there'll be two. One is called a debt service reserve account. So what the banks will say is that you must reserve 6 months worth of debt payments in a separate account before you pay yourself any profits. So if the project goes wrong, the bank know they've got 6 months worth of debt payments to cover themselves whilst they try to recover the project. And secondly, a maintenance reserve, you must reserve the cost of maintaining the project for 1 year in a separate bank account. So if anything goes wrong, they know they can maintain the project whilst they step in and try to rescue it. And these all come from the point of view that the bank have lent non-recourse to this company. They've got nowhere else to go if this project goes wrong. And hence they want a cover ratio test to make sure there's enough money to pay them, more than enough money to pay them every month. They want a gearing requirement, so you have to put some money in. They want a margin which is higher than they would normally charge. and they want 2 reserve accounts, a debt service and a maintenance to cover themselves in case the project goes wrong. And finally, if the project goes wrong, they've got what are called step-in rights, where they can step into the project and take control of the project whilst they try to put it back on track before they lose their money. And they've started from the point of view that this is a very low risk investment, so they don't want to lose their money under any circumstances. Okay. Then finally, risk. So remember, we started by talking about if you build a solar farm, it's a very low risk investment. Panels are proven technology. The sun's going to come up every day. The only real risk you have in solar is the cost of electricity, how much you can sell it for. Biogas is much harder. It's a living, breathing, organic process. You are relying on trillions of bacteria to convert your feedstock into gas. That gas yield will vary depending on what you put in. So as we said, if I put in pork pies and cakes, I'm going to get a much higher gas yield than I've put in pig shit, because the pig has taken out some of the energy for oinking and walking about. Landfill gas goes down over time because I'm not putting in more rubbish every day into the hole. I've covered the hole, so the amount of gas will go down over time. This whole thing, the energy from biogas plants relies upon the feedstock. So unlike wind or solar, I'm not relying on the weather. I'm relying on someone physically turning up every day and feeding the plant. So I need to be certain that that person is going to turn up every day for the next 20 years and that they can source the key feedstock. Easy for crop-based plants because I'm relying on the farmer. Harder for food waste plants because I'm relying on the existence of food waste, and the whole food industry, the supermarkets, the factories, etc., spend their whole lives trying to minimize waste. So if I'm relying on a food waste plant business, I'm kind of swimming against a massive corporate tide, because Sainsbury's and the food producers obsess about reducing food waste, whereas I want it to exist to feed my plant, if that makes sense. And food waste, although it's tempting because it has a much higher gas yield, is a very difficult product to get gas from because the yields bounce around all over the place. And then finally, I have to get rid of the digestate. The plant doesn't turn 100% of the feedstock into gas, so I'm left with a residual component which I have to dispose of either by making it to fertilizer or pellets, but I have to have a route to market to get rid of it. So you can see from this slide, although biogas is a very compelling investment thesis because of transport, amongst other things, it's much harder to do than it is to build a solar farm or a wind farm. And hence returns for investors tend to be much higher because they're taking far more risk. So finally, 22, just some headline facts and figures. There are 17,500 AD plants in Europe, the bulk of which are in Germany. I think there are about 10,000 plants in Germany, and there are about 600 plants in the UK. This is because Germany had a subsidy scheme for biogas for many years, and virtually every farmer in Germany built himself a biogas AD plant. Biogas is an attractive form of renewables for government because it's 24 hours. The plants produce gas 24 hours a day. The gas can be turned into electricity 24 hours a day. So it has that key quality of being dispatchable, i.e. it can be called upon and dispatched whenever there's a need for electricity. One of the reasons gas prices have gone up so radically this last week is because of a lack of wind. There's a big depression over the Atlantic and wind production has dropped off a cliff. And hence gas prices have gone up because they needed to buy gas to power plant stations. AD plants don't have that risk. They're independent of the weather. They produce gas and electricity 24 hours a day. And in Europe at the moment, 10,500 megawatts is produced by AD plants. And just to put that into context, that's about 4 Hinkley Point nuclear power stations equivalent. Once we've got the gas, we can either turn it into electricity. We saw the little picture on the diagram, the little engine turning gas into electricity. We can put it into the gas grid for heating and cooking, or we can liquefy it and put it into trucks. Transport-based Biogas is a huge investment sector at the moment because of the renewable fuel transport obligation. So the oil companies like Shell and BP are investing hundreds of millions of pounds in building biogas plants so they can still sell liquid fuels on the forecourts to the truck industry, to the airline industry, and to planes. And we are a long way, despite the hype, we are still 20, 30 years away from seeing a battery-powered train or a battery-powered long heavy-duty truck or a battery-powered plane. So there will be a need for liquid fuels for the next 20 years, and biogas, either derived from waste, manure, or crops, can play a huge part in meeting that requirement. And apologies again that you can't see me, but just picture Alex Hammond and you'll be there or thereabouts. And I'm happy to take any questions. I'm not quite sure mechanically how that's going to work.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Michael. I'm conscious from experience how very difficult it can be to have someone else moving your slides, even when you're in the same room and you can see what's on the screen. So that was a masterpiece of making do. So thank you very much for that. I've discovered it's also quite difficult to make the right announcement even when you've only got two pieces of paper to choose between. I should have told everybody that the meeting is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel in due course, and we encourage you to share that recording, which will give you the details when it's available, with colleagues who weren't able to be here this lunchtime. If you have questions, please ask those questions via the Q&A function on your Teams screen. And if you see that someone else has asked a question that you think is a good one, please vote for that, because we may not have time for all the questions that have been asked. But in the meantime, okay, so I see some questions, the published ones. Are these so a quick question to our my colleagues, if these are questions that that have been done. So there's a question about you mentioned the possibility of storing food for the of using the CO2 byproduct for the food industry. A question from Gabriel is that capturing it at a high purity, which is what the food industry needs, would lead to quite a big energy penalty. And so, do you know of any projects that have actually assessed whether this would be profitable, given the additional costs they'd have to incur? Or are people frantically looking at it now just in case it would become profitable?
Yeah, you had, first thing is to say, is it depending on what I'm doing with the biogas. If I'm putting the biogas into an engine, I don't have to split out the CO2 and the CH4. The engines will run on a mixture of CO2 and CH4. Just like your car engine, breathes in mainly nitrogen, CO2, it breathes in everything and still works. So it doesn't need pure gas to work. If I'm putting the gas into the grid, or I'm liquefying it for transport, I do need to split out the CO2 and the CH4 anyway. And the grid in particular are very picky about what gets put into the grid. So I have to achieve a very high level of purity of CH4 just to put it into the grid. And a byproduct of that is I'm invariably producing very pure CO2. The other thing to say, and there's no nice way of saying this, is CO2 is mainly used in the food industry to kill pigs and chickens. So it doesn't have to, you're not drinking it or eating it. It's used to kill pigs and chickens, to be frank. It doesn't go into beer and lemonade, or not very much of it does. And the stuff that comes out of biogas plants is invariably used in the abattoir process.
Okay, thank you for that. There was a question which came in anonymously, which is whether it would be possible to store the gas instead of flaring it. And I actually had a linked thought myself, being an electricity person, whether if you did store some of your gas and had a slightly bigger power plant per relative to the biogas plant, rather than running it all the time and getting the price of electricity, whatever that was, could you profitably concentrate your output in the hours when electricity was more expensive?
Yeah, I think we've for the plant I'm involved in, we've talked about that a lot. It doesn't really justify the investment. Storing gas is expensive because invariably you have to compress it, and compressing gas takes up a lot of electricity. And so the electricity you use to compress the gas is probably more than you would get by then releasing it back into the engine to burn it. Do you see what I mean? So because my gas plant produces gas 24 hours a day, so if I've got to store gas produced at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I need to liquefy it, to compress it, I'm having to buy electricity from the grid at a very high price. And then when I release the gas back into the grid, the economics probably don't stack up. So if I could store the gas without compressing it, if I had an enormous tank, it would work. The moment I have to compress it using electricity, it kills the economics. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Michael, we're apparently getting some feedback, and possibly when I'm speaking, if you muted and then of course unmuted yourself. I've been finding some things at my end. There's a question from Will H, which is it financially viable to run the plant that solely produces liquefied gas? And for transport and industry, how do the biofuels compare with hydrogen?
Yeah, I mean, because of the renewable transport fuel obligation and the certificate scheme, which I talked about, plants that produce gas for industry are very, very profitable at the moment because there's a shortage of biogas for industry generally. So the people like Shell and BP are buying biogas at a much higher price than they would be paying for it in the grid. So green molecules are selling at a premium and to the oil companies for transport, and hence biogas is very valuable. The issue with hydrogen is just how you produce hydrogen. You have to, at the moment, use electricity to create hydrogen, and so it's expensive to do. Whereas we can make biogas from bacteria, and it's a much cheaper process than it is to use electricity to make hydrogen. So there is some talk of green hydrogen, where we use the power from wind farms at times when prices are very low, and we put hydrogen production plants adjacent to wind farms. So in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, when it's very windy, but the power price is very low because everyone's asleep, that's the time you then use that electricity to make hydrogen. The advantage of biogas is that we don't need to use electricity to make it. We rely on bacteria. We don't get paid, obviously. And secondly, we can produce biogas 24 hours a day. So I think biogas production is easier and cheaper to do than hydrogen in the short term, at least.
Okay, thank you. A question from Cormac is whether many biogas plants use food waste collected from domestic homes, thinking that might be a more reliable source than supermarkets.
Yeah, great question. I mean, some people do. The big attraction of food waste plants is that you get paid to take the waste. Whereas unlike crop-based or manure-based plants, where if it's crop-based, I have to pay the farmer because I'm buying the maize. If I've got a food waste plant, someone else pays me to take the waste because it's a waste product. So that's the big attraction. The difficulty is domestic household collection, source separated, curbside separated food waste. It's not common. Some councils do it, but it's not everywhere. And the councils that you don't really want to truck this stuff very far because it has very little value. So, I really need all of my households to be within 50 miles max of my plant. I really don't want to be trucking food waste 100, 200 miles across the country because the economics of it will kill it. So I need lots of households who are all collecting their food waste within 50 miles of my plant. And now that does exist in some cities where you've got high housing density and the councils collect the food waste, but it's not as common as you would think. But you're quite right, there is a lot of gas being thrown, a lot of energy being thrown away in food waste. I think in this country we throw away something like 10 million tons of food waste a year. Some incredible number. And all of that could produce gas for transport.
Okay, thank you. Have you any thoughts about, or perhaps experience of any projects that generate biogas using the wastewater treatment plants?
Yeah, these are very common in sewage-based plants are probably where this whole industry started. So the water companies were running plants on sewage, I think as many as 10, 15 years ago. So they are very common, and manure-based plants are very common. I'm doing one in Holland at the moment that we rely on 500,000 tons a year of pig shit. And in Holland, they have a lot of pigs, and it's producing a lot of shit, to be frank. And at the moment, it gets trucked to Poland because there is nowhere to dispose of it within Holland. So somebody out there today is a guy driving a tanker full of pig shit to Poland, and he does that every single day. So manure-based plants and sewage-based plants are common. Fundamentally, though, as I said in the speech, it's just true biology. There's just less energy in manure than there is in food waste or crop-based. And so I need a higher volume of waste to get the same volume of gas.
And although presumably if the alternative is driving it all the way to Poland, the amount they're willing to pay you to take it off your hands might be a bit better.
Yeah, and that's the attraction of manure-based plants, is that if you have places like Holland where they just physically can't, they don't have enough land to spread it to land, so they need to truck it to Poland where they've got more land, and so they will pay you rather than truck it to Poland. But the counter to that is it has less gas in it because the pig has taken some out for oinking and growing and what have you.
I know you mentioned that you don't have to pay the bacteria that you use, but Marco has asked how complex it is to manage the bacteria stock in AD reactors.
It depends on the feedstock. It's a great question. You use enzymes. I'm not a chemist and I don't really understand what enzymes do, but you do have to buy enzymes to put into the tank to help the bacteria. What you're bumping into here, it's a really interesting area, is evolution. Things like straw have evolved not to be eaten by bacteria, which is why you get thatched cottages. You think about straw, it doesn't decompose easily. And you can put it on the roof of your house. My father-in-law's got a thatched cottage and he changes the straw once every 30 years. So, and it's not treated at all, that's just raw straw. So straw, if you put raw straw into an AD plant, it won't decompose. The bacteria won't be able to eat it because straw has evolved over millions of years not to be eaten by bacteria. And hence you have to treat the straw before you put it in to break open the cells so that the bacteria can access the sugars and starches which they use to make the gas. And similarly, if I put food waste in, I have to depackage it. So sandwiches, for example, you imagine your sandwich from Marks and Spencer's, it comes in a little plastic box. The bacteria can't eat the box. And hence we have to remove the sandwich from the box to put it into the tank. And you'll appreciate this is, a mechanical process, but it's expensive. And the more we package food, the harder it is to treat in AD plants. And depackaging food waste is a big issue in the industry.
Okay, thank you. There's a second question from Gabriel, which is for BiomeFrame, how the new scheme compares with the renewable heat incentive from the point of view of the producer.
Yeah, great question, Gabriel. From the producer's point of view, the transport scheme seems to be more lucrative because the value, remember we talked about the certificates, and I can sell my certificate to a fuel producer and I can sell the gas to somebody else. So I'm already getting paid twice for the gas. Secondly, the value of the certificates is driven by the market. So it just goes up. As there's a shortage of green molecules in Europe, the fuel producers, the Shells and BPs of the world, are having to buy certificates instead. And they can only buy certificates in relation to the amount of fuel that's being produced, the gas that's being produced. And so the value of these certificates is going up. I think it started at about 20p a litre, and it's now gone to 32p a litre. And probably will go to 50p a litre within a year. So if you're producing biogas, putting it into transport is probably more valuable than using it for heating.
Okay, Thank you very much. I do have one question from Tim, who says, can you comment on whether biogas in traditional gas names, whether it would be possible to get to the sort of volume needed for something I hadn't heard of myself, but I think I can tell what it's going to be about, Ecotricity's Save Our Boilers campaign.
Yeah, can you? I think the question is, can you make enough biogas to power the whole of Europe's domestic heating? Probably not. You'd need an awful lot of AD plants. So this is why the government is saying to the fuel companies already, you have to blend 10% of your fuel with biogas fuel, and they're already saying 10% is a huge challenge. You couldn't power 100% of Europe's domestic heating with biogas. You would have to have an enormous number of plants, which is why governments are trying to electrify heating in terms of ground source heat pumps, etc., because I don't think they believe you can get there with biogas.
Thank you very much for that. So I suppose one very final question was, when you were talking about the renewable transport fuels system, the certificates and the obligation, it felt quite, I wondered whether it was similar to the system that was used sort of from 2001 to about 2013 for financing wind and solar, the renewables obligation, or was it more generally a tradable green certificate system?
Yeah, great question, Richard. It's conceptually similar. What the government are doing is they're trying to encourage investment into biogas. And so what they thought is, well, how do we do that? And we start by saying, well, we say to the fuel producers, the BPs and Shells of this world, you need to blend a certain proportion of renewable fuel with your fossil fuel. The second problem they then had was that the fuel producers promptly went and bought palm oil and were cutting down rainforests to produce palm oil, and they were then saying that's renewable fuel. And the government thought, haha, that's not really what we want you to be doing. So they brought in a certificate system, and it does, so the blend is say 10%. Let's keep the math simple, it's slightly less, but let's say it's 10%. They're saying to you, BP, you have to blend 10% of your fuel with renewable fuel, but the amount you can derive from crop-based fuels like palm, we're going to reduce to say 3 or 4%. And the other 6 to 7% you must get from waste-based fuels. And this encourages people then to invest in plants that rely on waste. But critically, from our point of view, straw and agricultural byproducts like the husks of shells of, sugar beet shells and residue, the shells of peanuts, etc., these all count as waste. So the government is saying, we don't want you to substitute crops to make gas. We want you to use the byproduct of crop production. And you think of it, straw is the byproduct of wheat production. When I grow a field of wheat, I only want the head of the corn to turn into flour, etc. The rest of the plant is waste. And the government very cleverly said, if you use that waste product to make gas, we will give you a higher value. And the way they do this, I'm sorry to dwell on this, but it's quite key to the whole idea, is the number of certificates per litre of fuel is a function of how the fuel was made. And this is an absolutely key point. I'm just going to dwell on this. So if I make a litre of biogas using palm oil, which is the worst thing you can do, you get 1 certificate. If I make the same litre of biogas using straw as a waste product of agriculture, I get 3.5 certificates. So I'm massively incentivized to develop technologies that use waste products rather than cut down rainforests. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I'm conscious that we're now sort of into extra time.
Yeah.
But there's, a comment in a sense from Rob, which is Malmo collects food waste and co-locates refuse facilities and ADs with bus garages so that all Malmo's public transport runs on its waste.
Yeah.
But an actual question from Sebastian, which we will make the last question because we can't have too much extra time. That would be very unfair on Michael. But would be that, financially speaking, is it difficult to compete with alternative treatment means such as landfill in terms of the gate fees? In other words, the amount of money you get paid to take the waste from the person that wants to get rid of it?
Yeah, a great question. What the government have done, I'll come on to something else in this. What the government have done is they don't want you putting organic waste into landfill, because as we've seen, landfills are just uncontrolled AD plants, and if you put organic waste into landfill, it will still produce methane. It's under the ground, it still has a long chain hydrocarbon molecule, it's going to decompose into CH2 and CH4, and that will be emitted in an uncontrolled way. So they don't want councils or anybody to put organic waste into landfill. So the way they stop you doing that is they tax it. And it's taxed at currently about £100 a ton. So if I've got a ton worth of food waste and I want to put it into a landfill site, I'll have to pay £100 in tax. Plus I've got to pay a fee to the guy who owns the landfill site. So I'm probably looking at £120, £130 a ton. Hence, if I can find an AD plant that will take it for £20 a ton, I'll save money. And hence, if you think there are 10 million tons of organic waste produced in this country every year, there's a huge market of not putting it into landfill. And this is why AD plants, and remember, organic waste is not just food waste, it's also paper and card and wood. Anything made from an organic substance will eventually decompose and produce methane and CO2. And hence, energy from waste plants, which we haven't talked about at all, and which we could probably do a separate lecture on those, get paid to take the waste because the people producing the waste are trying to avoid paying the landfill tax. So if I've got an energy from waste plant that can take paper, card, wood, etc., I will get paid £100 a ton to take that waste rather than put it into landfill. And if I've got an AD plant that can take food waste, again, I'll get paid £100 a ton. So that's how the government try and divert waste away from landfills, by taxing the act of putting it into landfill. One thing I would say is my email is on the Greendraft website, but it's m.ware@green-giraffe.eu. If you've got any other questions or thoughts that occur to you after this lecture, then feel free to drop me an email. m.ware@green-giraffe.eu.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed, Michael, because that was a very interesting, very wide-ranging talk, and you handled, again, a very wide variety of questions with great skill and showing, the depth of your knowledge and your experience. So thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
The Energy Futures Lab runs a whole series of other events, and if you signed up to this one, if you signed up to the mailing list as part of it, you will be told about those, and I hope that to see you virtually or in real life at some of those in future. But for now, thank you very much to our speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. And feel free to drop me an email if you have any other questions. Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.